here. I am Meenakshi Tomar, faculty at JGBS and a proud member of CAPBREI. I welcome you all to the 7th lecture of the Pandemic Lecture Series hosted by Center of Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovation at JGBS. You all will be glad to know that since last month, CAPBREI has already hosted 6 lectures where we got the opportunity to hear insights from very interesting speakers. In fact, the 6th lecture was hosted today morning. I am happy to announce that today's lecture, which is the 7th lecture from the series, will be delivered by Professor Vandana Sharma, who is a faculty at JGBS. She is currently pursuing her doctoral degree in the Public Policy and Management Group from IIM Kolkata. She has previously worked with an international non-profit funding agency. A very warm welcome to Professor Vandana from our side. In today's discussion, she has extended a very interesting topic for all of us here: biodiversity, economic relations, and the pandemic. The ideals of economic growth and making of the pandemic. We all talk about a lot of things, right from retailing, supply chain, logistics, and whatnot. This is something which is very, very interesting for us to know because she's going to talk about those diversities which are getting affected, but very less is spoken about. I request the participants to type their questions, if any, in the chat box provided. We will be taking the questions during Q&A round. I further request you all to please keep your mics on the mute mode throughout the lecture. Thank you all, and I now invite Professor Vandana to please take on the stage and go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Meenakshi Tomar, for the great introduction. And good evening, everybody, and thank you for logging in today. I will basically be talking about a few very crucial interconnections between human health, the economy, as in the way it functions, the direction in which the economy moves, and nature or biodiversity. Now, the main objective of exploring these connections is to be able to understand better the reasons for the making of the pandemic. So we have already kind of talked a lot about how what were the after effects of the pandemic, but this is a chance to reflect and discuss something on what could have possibly led to the pandemic. So I will mainly discuss how a particular way of functioning of the economy by way of solely prioritizing economic growth impacts biodiversity, and how this prioritizing of ideals of economic growth gets reflected in multiple policies of the state. Now, state policies play a major role in propelling an economic idea and in also addressing a crisis like the one that we are currently facing, right? So I would like to start with laying out this this dilemma that all of us kind of know in our conscious as to how that there possibly is a conflict in the functioning of the economy and human life, right? And this is something that became very evident in the immediate past. So what I think is that this dilemma of whether to save the economy or save human health gets manifested in 2 ways. One is a more immediate one, right, that we saw getting manifested immediately as the pandemic occurred. So which basically was that if we continued economic activity, it would increase the risk of transmission, right? And so we had a sequence of policy responses like measures of social distancing, relief package by the government and even the non-profit sector. and whether to increase testing and improve the healthcare infrastructure in general, even in future, right? But there are other ways of manifestation of this conflict, and that happens through this economy, biodiversity, and human health linkage, which I have here put it in a box for you. Now, this somewhat happens in the background, and we will try to explicitly examine this today. The idea is to understand this relationship, the relevant policies that contribute to this relationship, and then try to think, reflect, and devise some way forward. Now, before we do this, let's first look at the current status of biodiversity and what it actually means. Now, uh, these days, things mean differently to different set of people, right? Nature might mean something else to me and something else to someone else, right? So just to be on the same page of understanding, when I mention biodiversity here, it basically means all life on Earth, humans and other species, and refers to the biological variety in all its forms, from the genetic makeup of plants and animals to cultural diversity. So the key point here is this word variety, and genetic as well as cultural variety. And I will unpack all of this as we proceed in the lecture. And here we have a graph which is from the IPBES 2019 report. And here you can see that the cumulative percentage of species that uh, came to the verge of extinction has exponentially increased in the past almost 100 years, right? So this is to address the argument that nature changes, right? Uh, whether it is due to our influence or not, nature will change over a period of time. But what I want to what I want to stress upon here is the rate at which the extinction is actually happening, and that actually rings an alarm. The second important graph, also from the same report, is to see, with respect to certain indicators, that we have very well-established indicators to basically say that we really have not been able to, let's say, maintain or create habitats for other species. And the other one, which assumes importance in current times, is this regulation of detrimental organism and biological processes, right? And if you see, the indicator here is extent of natural habitat in agriculture areas and diversity of competent hosts of vector-borne diseases. And this is something that we will discuss in detail in today's definition. So now, this is basically a huge table which tells us on what all indicators we have not really done very well. So once we know that we really are losing a very important component of life on Earth, which is biodiversity, now let us move on to understand how it actually impacts human health, right? And here I've put for you three main ways in which biodiversity influences human health, right? And the respective policies and activities and how they are interlinked, right? So the first thing is that this is something that we all of us kind of know, right? That biodiversity or natural phenomena that occurs in the environment may have both positive and negative effects, right? So biodiversity gives us nutrients, medicines, ecosystem functions like purification of air and water, which is all the positive things that we have been deriving from nature, but it can also be the source of pathogens which can lead to infectious diseases, right? And that becomes very crucial in the discussion today. The second way in which biodiversity and human health, in a way, both gets affected is through the economic activity, right? Which is, let's say, air pollution because of massive levels of industrialization or pollution, and soil degradation because of the kind of agriculture that we are doing these days, right? And the third thing is something which is very important to understand, is what we are doing to protect nature, right? What we are doing to protect biodiversity, which is here as the conservation policies, and how it impacts health, right? So it does have implication for food and nutrition security of very vulnerable population groups who live around these forest areas. And health and nutrition data, especially of India, shows that uh, uh, the malnutrition or the health issues are mostly centered within these communities. So certain conservation policies might have effect on food and nutrition and overall health and well-being of the most vulnerable people of society. The second way in which this interlinkage gets manifested is also what we are doing to preserve our health, which is the pharmaceutical industry, the whole the products, the pharmaceutical products that we use in huge amounts these days. That also has impact on biodiversity. And here, this is one example that I've put, is it is affecting marine life. This picture here is of a fish, which is, you know, totally made up of these medicines that we are consuming. So basically, we are polluting the water body because all the antibiotics and everything that we consume goes out of our body and then pollutes the water, the marine life, and then it affects the fish and the marine life. So uh, the policies and the activities which we design are also to be scrutinized as to how it affects biodiversity and health, right? So these are basically the three ways in which this interlinkage actually works. The second important aspect of biodiversity, and this is very important to note when it comes to the discussion in relation to human health, and that is the biodiversity that exists inside our body, right? So when, let's say, a conservationist or a forest conservationist will talk about biodiversity, maybe he or she can quit looking at this point of biodiversity. But since we are looking at the connection or the understanding of the word biodiversity with respect to human health, I think this becomes extremely important, which is the whole microbiome that is inside our body. And there are several studies, and this I have used a WHO report to understand this. And what it says is that changes in composition of the microbiomes are frequently associated with infection and with a wide range of immunological, gastrointestinal, metabolic, and even psychiatric disorders these days. So whatever we consume might affect our microbiome, be it food or be it medicines, right? Now, there is a disclaimer here that these are mostly correlational studies. So there's no real causal experiment done yet. But there are some experiments which clearly demonstrate that increasing microbial biodiversity within our body can protect against a lot of infections. And when I say the human microbiome, it contains 10 times more microorganisms than cells that comprise the human body, and it exists in the skin, the gut, the airways, etc. So basically we are kind of comprised of these tiny microorganisms. And over a period of time, we kind of have begun to start losing it. And lately we have realized that it has impacts on our immune system response, and on a myriad of other problems. Right now, some of the reasons here, which I've just listed down here, but I will be discussing later on, is of the loss of biodiversity inside the human body, is antibiotic and antimicrobial use that can alter the composition and functioning of the human microbiome. The loss of biodiverse environment for human habitation as urbanization increases and proximity to nature decreases. Now, this is something that they have come up till now, the problem here is, since we do not really know what is the source of the microbiome, therefore there's more research that is to be done. But till now, what we have arrived at is that engaging with the biodiversity outside, that is this interaction with nature, is extremely important for to have a flourishing microbiome even within our body, right? And the third most important thing is the unvaried fast food diets that we have started kind of consuming. Right? So this was about what biodiversity means and what is its connection with health, and in what ways health and biodiversity kind of impact each other. Now, talking in the context of this pandemic, this is a piece of fact which is extremely crucial, is how does this biodiversity loss play out when it comes to infectious diseases. So basically, approximately 2/3 of the known human infectious diseases are shared with animals, right? And this chart here on the slide basically shows what are the factors responsible for almost more than 50% of these infectious diseases. And when I say infectious diseases, here we're referring to the zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases basically are diseases which are caused by viruses or pathogens which have jumped species or which have come from the animals, right? So this chart basically shows us, like you see, mostly the green region and the yellow one is what is important, is that change in land use and agriculture intensification and the food industry changes. This is a key factor. These are the key factors which emerge, right? So these factors basically are responsible for more than 50% of most of these infectious diseases that we're actually dealing with. And what is said that most of these areas which are high in biodiversity may actually also be high in pathogens, right? But they also have, because of the genetic diversity and species diversity, there also is a diversity in host animals, which the pathogens can, affect. So even though it does supply pathogens, it also gives a protective shield, right? A protective factor for preventing the transmission onto humans. So this is basically a glimpse of how biodiversity loss by way of land use changes and agriculture intensification, food industry changes, actually have a very, very huge impact on infectious diseases. Now, I will come to discuss this connection between economic growth and the ideals of economic growth, which have kind of interchangeably begun to be used with development, right? So how this basically has impacted biodiversity loss. And I believe that the dominant thinking, this kind of a economic thinking, which has dominated our economic policies, have impacted and resulted in this kind of massive land use change. So what are these ideals of economic growth, and why does it have this kind of impact on land use and agriculture, right? So these ideas of economic growth basically is the whole debate started in the 70s, right? When suddenly the whole environmental movement started, and people became conscious that maybe we are pushing our planetary limits, right? But and therefore the whole sustainability and the whole sustainable development paradigm, that thought began to emerge in the 1980s, right? But somehow this idea of unlimited economic growth kind of hijacked this debate on sustainability, and it was based on this one assumption, which is very crucial, and that assumption is this belief that once we start this process of economic growth, and there is enough quote unquote prosperity and development, we will be able to delink or decouple from the environmental base through dematerialization and depollution. So to simply state this, the idea was that once we start growing, we will have more money, we will start investing in cleaner technologies, and therefore our footprint on the planet will eventually decrease, right? And based on this assumption, the whole sustainable development paradigm uh, uh, basically could harmonize economic growth, social welfare, and environmental protection, right? So the Rio Declaration actually recalled for economic growth in more than 20 of its articles. Now, so how did this impact policy? So the resultant policy is this increased impetus on urbanization, mass consumption, basically pushing material needs, and movement of people from farming to modern sectors. Now, that movement ought to happen, but uh, the way farming changed, and the kind and the volume of people that started moving, that itself is a problem that most of the economists face, is the problem of structural transformation, right? So it basically, as you see with this assumption that we will be able to use less and less material, which which helped us meet policy. Let us now see what actually happened over the past 20-25 years. And this is the evidence that we have so far with respect to dematerialization or decoupling of GDP growth and usage of material or natural resources. So what the evidence tells us so far is that absolute dematerialization cannot be claimed, and it can only be claimed uh, via the channel of outsourcing. So it's basically that the more developed countries who are developing the technologies and who have the resources can now actually move their production base to countries of the global south, and which is what we see in the case of Japan here, right? So even though the GDP, which is the blue line, has been increasing, the domestic material consumption has decreased, but the material footprint still continues because they're just not doing the operations domestically, but doing it in some other countries. Like a lot of the countries have they do the extractive mining operations, let's say in Africa or in Latin American countries, or even India, right? So because of this evidence, we really cannot claim that absolute decoupling of the ideals of economic growth, which was based on this assumption that we will achieve decoupling one day. Till today, we really do not have that evidence. And so now we kind of will look at the process. So the main the key connecting factor was the land use change, right, which came out as an important factor for several infectious diseases. And if we see this process, which is from a paper which was just released in this year, basically helps us in conceptually understanding how economic growth increases, leads to this outcome of biodiversity loss, right? And it happens that through increased resource use and trade, climate change, land use changes, invasive species, and that leads to biodiversity loss. And this here, this blue bubble here is something which helps us, connect this whole linkage of economic growth, biodiversity, and health, right? Because even for the spread of infectious diseases, we just saw that land use changes is a very important factor which comes up. Now, focusing on the kind of land use changes and infectious diseases, and here we'll focus mostly on agriculture and food industry changes, because that factor has emerged to be a very strong one. So I urge that maybe you can look at this book, which is by an ecologist and epidemiologist, which talks about how big farms make big flus, basically saying that this whole model of industrial agriculture is basically creating conditions which increases the risk of transmission, and I mean, COVID is one example, and we are currently impacted by it. But then, if we look at the case of US, influenza is a huge issue there, right? So people die of flu. So this book basically talks about that connection. And when we say big farms, that is what comprises that is basically what makes our food system. That is where we get our food from. And it is based on this idea of plantation economy. And what does plantation economy mean? It's basically an economy based on agriculture mass production. Now, the key word here is mass production, right? Usually of a few commodity crops grown on large farms called plantations. So this is the logic which has been driving agriculture to a large extent, that we need to produce a lot. And that is also fair given the context in the past, that there were famines and droughts, right? And of course, we were not this food sufficient in at least 100 years back. But probably in the current context, we need to revisit this whole logic, right, of plantation economy. Now, how does this plantation economy, increase the chances of the spread of zoonotic viruses? Is that because you have big farms, and this includes both meat production and production of crops. So when it comes to livestock production, these huge farms basically requires confinement of large number of animals in very small spaces. It definitely narrows the genetic diversity, and fast animal turnover amplifies the risk of diseases emerging and spreading. So basically, because they live in such close proximity, the virus has a chance to, survive for a longer time, because the next host on which the virus can thrive is right next to it, right? The second reason is that habitat destruction due to commercial agriculture, unchecked urbanization, and land and resource grabs. And this is one quote from one of the ecologists who says that destroy landscapes and the species you are left with are the ones that humans get the disease from. So the whole idea here is that the more we scale up, the more we uh, produce food, be it meat or be it plants, at this huge scale, we will tend to destroy habitats, we will tend to destroy ecosystems, and then it will eventually lead to extinction of the species, and then of course we'll be left with the ones which we get the disease from, right? Well, how does this industrial farming based food system, affect our internal biodiversity, right? And as I mentioned when I started the presentation, is that our food preferences are shifting, and industrial food basically will supply us, or we have more access to processed food, and that will have a negative impact on the biodiversity of the body, or the microbiome, right? The other is with respect to, and this is from a report which was just released, I think on 10th of June, which is the Body Burden, Pandemics and the Industrial Food Animal Farming, is that what are we doing with the animals which are produced industrially, right? And that is that the highest, and that is that we are giving them, we are injecting lots of antibiotics, antimicrobial, vaccines, growth hormones, and that will definitely come into our food chain, right? And what is evident now is that the animals in China and India have the highest level of antimicrobial resistance. So because you're fed with so much of antibiotics, it will be difficult to in fact cure an animal, or if we become if we develop that resistance, because we are obviously consuming that animal, it will be much more difficult in future to treat diseases or treat infections, right? And that in fact the WHO has acknowledged that that is going to be the next big thing that we will have to to address. So this is how this kind of farming system basically impacts the biodiversity that is inside our body. Now, why are we here? Like, why are we at this kind of juncture? Is because I think there is a divergence in economic thinking and what conservation or conservationists way they think. So and because there's no convergence of issues or convergence in disciplines from where this thought process is emerging, is I think that is that makes the root of this problem. And this table here, to simplify, basically is about uh, a review of policy documents, right? And 28 of such policy documents. 7 of those policy documents talk about sustainability, right? And 21 of those policy documents, and these are most of these documents are the UN document or the MDG documents. And the second cohort of documents was these 21 documents were talking about biodiversity conservation, right? And when we look at how they view this relationship between economic growth and biodiversity, and we see that only 6 documents basically acknowledge this fact that maybe unlimited economic growth can have a detrimental impact on biodiversity out of 28 documents. And this is where I would point out to be the root of the problem, is that economic thought or the priorities uh, which is enlisted in these documents do not really include biodiversity, and conservation and biodiversity is not even questioning this economic thought. So this divergence is something that probably is very urgent to address. Now, I will discuss some of the examples or the situation in India. And these are policies which are relevant for land use change, right? So I mentioned here the practices of the forest department, the practices of the practices undertaken through the agriculture policy, and I have put in here environmental impact assessment, because this is something which is very recent, right? There is a new notification which was released when the pandemic hit us, which was to modify the EIA, right? Which will basically help gaining better access of land for industrial purposes, right? So these 3, I believe, are the most relevant policy verticals which contribute to land use change. So what is happening in the forest department? So when we look at the practices of the forest department, and I speak from my own experience of fieldwork that I undertook during my PhD, is that forest is mostly is dominantly seen as a resource, right? And when you see it as a resource, it basically is a resource that should have a market value, right? You should be able to put a price tag on it. And the forest department mostly, or the forest policies mostly focus on production of timber, right? So, and this is a very interesting quotation from my own interviews from the forest officer in Odisha, where I was working. And he mentioned that we cannot revive the natural biodiversity that is lost. We can only plant trees that will grow fast and live longer. State resources cannot be wasted to plant trees that will grow slowly or are not resilient. So he explained to me that the trees which are native to this area are basically not very resilient, and they take years to grow. So how are we gonna, show accountability that where did we use the state resources? If we so if we plant teak, it grows fast. But let's say if we plant a local variety, let's say sal or any other tree which was local, it takes time. So how are we going to show the government that this is the outcome of our or this is how we use the money? So this is how he explained his dilemma. And what basically emerges from here is that we are losing our focus on natural biodiversity, and we are just when we are replanting trees, uh, we are planting the trees as per our own convenience, right? The second sector which is important is the agriculture department. And most of the practices, and there's huge work coming up which is problematizing this kind of agriculture, is that it promotes monoculture. And monoculture is nothing but planting one type of crop in the entire land, be it how much ever big that land is. So again, what we miss here is the keyword variety, which I mentioned when I was talking about the definition of biodiversity. So we are losing crop variety. And since most of the producer farmer households are also consumers, so most of them consume the food that they produce. So since they're losing a variety, since they don't grow a variety of crops, they tend to consume also less variety, a less diverse diet, so to say. So obviously then it pushes them towards bad health and malnutrition, right? So this is another quote saying that we basically from the agriculture officer who mentioned that our main focus is mainly to grow paddy and cotton. And if I can mention quickly here is that from the land records that I had, the land there is not even amenable to grow rice, because most of that is hilly region. So all this to basically say that maybe the state policy or the direction in which we move is very, very disconnected from what has naturally existed forever. The second thing is the environmental impact assessment, and it is making environmental clearances easier. Mining projects have been given much more leeway, and projects within the national park, wildlife sanctuaries, coral reefs, or even ecologically sensitive areas will be subject to public consultation only within that specific district. So, these spaces are huge, and sometimes public does not really reside inside the district in which the sanctuary is spread. So basically you're not consulting anybody outside the district, right? Now what is I've put here some a snippet. This is just a glimpse of the impact of this kind of policy direction or these practices of the state. And when we look at the forest in India, diversion still continues, right? We are losing the primary forest as in forest which has taken years to grow and thrive, the whole ecosystem of forest. That's the primary forest, and that is something that we are losing because we are because of the diversion of forest land for industrial purposes. And these two graphics are basically to explain, to show some of the recent incidents. I think you must be aware of the fire that took place in the oil well in Assam, I think 2 days back. and that is going to have a major repercussion on the local habitat, on the local people, the local ecosystem, right? And this example of Sun Pharma being given a land to expand its production inside a bird sanctuary in Tamil Nadu. So uh, these are some of the recent thing which has happened over the last couple of months when we were living in the times of pandemic. But when we look at the status of forest in our country, most of the forest, I mean, like 41% of the forest cover is what will qualify to be called as degraded forest. So we are basically losing a biodiverse forest, and what we are replanting is, I'm afraid, we cannot really call those spaces as forest, right? And that is something which is a cause of concern. The second is the impact on agriculture land due to these government practices. And this is a report on desertification in India, and it basically says that land degradation and desertification has increased in India, and agriculture is cited as one of the main reasons. And there's enough evidence by now which talks about the violence of Green Revolution, or what the science of Green Revolution actually did to the soil, and how its impact is now being felt by the farmers who are plowing that land, who are growing in that soil, and they are all experiencing the depletion in the soil quality that has happened due to the excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides, which we started using to increase food productivity, right? The other important impact is, and this is something that I have observed, that it gets missed out in most of the environmental movements, or when we talk about conserving the environment, we kind of miss this perspective, and that is the loss of knowledge that happens in this process. In the process of conservation, we tend to violate the rights to livelihood, food, and the loss of knowledge of the local people, because probably you and I won't be having as much a rich information about the local ecology as a person who has lived all of their lives in that particular landscape. And when we are designing these policies, we even though we ensure that local people participate, but in the execution of those programs. But what I want to point out here is that we are not really listening to them when we are designing a policy, and that makes a huge difference. We are just it's like I design a policy and then I tell them that please help me in implementation, and that is problematic. I think we need to listen to what their knowledge is, because I believe we don't know about that particular landscape where they have been living. And there is and this is now being increasingly recognized. There is much more studies that are coming up, which are urging policymakers to stop thinking forests as just timber, but also as food producing habitats. I mean, understand that forests are habitats and not just single trees. And these are some of the pictures from my own fieldwork, which shows the kind of diversity that people have access to in food, and most of these are collected from the forest, right? And this is how, and this picture basically shows the transition of what they eat. So their quantity of millets or other diverse forms or different forms of grains has definitely decreased, and what they have increasingly begun to consume is rice or staples, right? So these are the multiple ways in which people are affected, which is livelihoods plus a lot of other things. We generally tend to at least acknowledge that yes, livelihood gets affected, but food is something that we kind of miss out when we are when we see when we try to understand how the local people are getting affected by forest or land use changes. Now, a lot about what has happened till now and what we have been experiencing. And in the next two slides, I would be basically discussing about what we can do in future. And I would like to start with uh, citing this manifesto which the WHO released in May this year. And out of the several things that WHO is talking about in terms of increasing health infrastructure, in terms of reviving the food system, increase spending, to cope, to get out of this situation, the first point that this manifesto mentions is that we need to protect and preserve the source of human health, and that is nature, right? The manifesto mentions that the pandemic is a reminder of the intimate and delicate relationship between people and planet, and any efforts to make our world safer are doomed to fail unless they address the critical interface between people and pathogens and the existential threat of climate change that is making our earth less habitable. So in the spirit of this, I have a few policy prescriptions, or you would say certain suggestions that we can possibly adopt in future, and that is keeping in mind all of these factors which are there in this picture, and that is to address climate change, protect indigenous knowledge, indigenous culture, biodiversity, water is another important thing, and human health, of course. So looking at all these connections when we are trying to go back to normal or revive the economy. So the first point, I think, is transition to a more diverse farming system, which is away from monocultures. So again, the keyword of variety has to be brought back, right, into policy. Integration of a holistic understanding of forest within forest policy to be able to revive or in future create biodiverse ecosystems. And for that, we really need to include traditional ecological knowledge in designing a forest policy and not mere participation. The one thing that keeps worsening this dilemma is how do we give jobs to people, because we are a labor surplus economy, and a lot of people have to leave the primary sector or agriculture and move to modern sectors or industries, which is what economics teach us that that is the path of structural transformation, right? So while we are doing that, I think we need to also prioritize the creation of sustainable employment. And I do believe that it is a possibility as long as we, put it in our list of priorities, that when we generate employment, we also keep it in mind that it is sustainable. It is a sustainable kind of a work that we are creating for people. And of course, an industrial policy that is sensitive to conservation of habitats, right? So the environmental impact assessment should not probably be made in a way that is more comfortable for industries, and not account for the costs that a particular industry would have on the ecosystem, on the biodiversity or the ecosystem where it plans to develop. So these are the few things that I had to share. And thank you so much for your patient listening. And now I think I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Professor Vandana, for giving us such informative insights. Really an impressive presentation, talking and showcasing so many dimensions that we look at, but we definitely do not give a lot of thought to it. And yes, you have very well covered on how important is it to sort of integrate, harmonize economic growth, social welfare, and environmental protection. Because at the end of the day, biodiversity has a lot to do with our daily lives also. We are dependent on biodiversity in some manner or the other. Very recently, there have been many news channels who've been showcasing extinct birds all of a sudden arriving back to their country, and some birds that we forgot when we saw them last in our childhood. So thank you for bringing such an insightful session for us. I would now open the floor for any questions by the participants here. Please feel free to raise your question. We can unmute you, and you can straight away ask your question to Professor Vandana. Yes, Mr. Gurpreet, we'll just unmute you. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Go
Okay.
on, please.
First of all, a very, very nice presentation and a very good topic covered. I mean, thanks.
Thanks.
I just want to thank one of my friends who shared this to me. Good job.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. So, Professor Vandana, I have like especially one of the slide that you mentioned about, your findings in Odisha, And I really agree that, even if we are growing plants today, trees, we are just like growing something, not considering the nature, and we're just doing something. Okay, let's plant maybe 1 million tree or something, right? And probably I sense somewhere, that it's not the nature in their intent. It's basically again the economic activity in their intent. Actually, whosoever is making the policy, actually. Okay.
Yes.
For example, if they are planting maybe 1 million tree, that is an intent with, okay, in the future after 20 years I may be able to cut down these trees, actually, right?
Yep.
I think this is somewhere things are going wrong, and it would also worsen the situation in the future, actually. Okay, so that you really well covered, actually. But what do you think could be the possible solutions, because you also already covered those in the last slide very well, some of these suggestions or prescriptions. So I was just thinking, like, nowadays many people they really some examples we saw, they created some small forest, really biodiversity. I remember some of them in Chennai, and in some parts of the world as well, actually. Okay. So do you think these things also could be, some of the, some act as some of the solutions, or there is also something we can add? I mean, just as some basic level solutions, what could be, can you list some of them?
Um, it's one solution that I think is extremely doable, and which we don't do, especially in policy, is because of this perception, that we do not acknowledge somebody else's knowledge as knowledge. So my science, what I do in a laboratory is science, but what probably a tribal community knows through practice, of course, he or she would not have that language to communicate
Mm-hmm.
in the metric system or the science that we understand. But what I have understood by talking to most of the state officials is that uh, you don't even talk to people when you are designing policy, and then you complain. And this complaint is, I think, you go to any government office, and they'll tell you that these people don't want to work, they don't participate, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you never try to understand the reason why they're not participating, right? It's because
Yeah,
you
yeah.
never acknowledge their knowledge, you never ask them what they want. And in the name of participatory forest management and whatever committees are made, unless you include their knowledge, or even pay, or even look at them with respect, I mean, even
Mm-hmm.
that bare minimum respect, dignity, is something that that they don't receive. And one more major cause of concern is that over generations, this knowledge is something that we are losing, because
Mm-hmm.
since you are not respecting any other way of thought, any other way of understanding things, people are also getting convinced that this is the hierarchy of knowledge, and hence even they do not have are reluctant to participate.
Mm-hmm.
And that will increase the barrier uh, that we currently have.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, yes, talk to them as if they are people and that they know something. And probably we need to, this whole reverse learning is something that has to happen everywhere. Uh,
Yeah, I
we
agree.
need to
I agree. So
get down.
basically, like,
Yeah. Hmm.
sorry. So you were saying something.
No,
Then I
no,
will
I was
ask you.
just no, I was
Okay.
just continuing with the same.
So basically, it's like about, including the community that lives there and
Yes,
taking their suggestions and their
very
knowledge. And
much.
obviously, it helps because it reminds me of one more thing.
Mm,
I was reading an article long back. It's like
mm,
2 years ago. I was reading an article about the plight of the water bodies in India. I mean,
mm,
and then I also, parallelly read an article wherein, it was told that our communities, like not more than like 100 or 150 years ago,
mm.
how they used to manage the local ponds, local lakes, and
Exactly.
there
Pani
was a lot of.
Panchayat.
Oh, okay, yeah, I
Pani,
was not recalling able to thank you
yeah,
for this. So,
Pani
do you
Panchayat.
think like similar kind of thing at the community level, if the people are
Definitely.
given due respect and they are able to cultivate that habit of this biodiversity, probably starting with some examples and then this example leading to the other, maybe kind of network, a better marketing, probably that could be one of the starting
Uh,
points for, right?
Definitely, community empowerment is extremely important, and why I cannot emphasize this enough, and is because most of the conservationists uh, are believe in this in something called fortress conservation. I don't know if you've heard this
Mm-hmm.
word. Is that you separate people
Mm-hmm.
from the local area where they were living. So most of these national parks and sanctuaries which are made, uh, uh, a lot of times the people are not allowed to live
Yeah,
inside
yeah,
with the impression
yeah.
that they will spoil the environment, but they have been living there
Mm.
for centuries, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is all about changing perception as to how we see the people, uh,
Mm-hmm.
out there who have been living, and we just don't acknowledge that any other knowledge is knowledge.
Yeah, yeah,
So
got it.
we need to address that. And to mention a fact, I think I'll miss it otherwise. Most of the forest dense countries, especially in Latin America, Mexico, you see as much as 90% of the forest are under under the control of the community. So the community does most of the conservation practices.
Okay, that sounds good. That so we can relate
So
actually the solution.
we do have examples around the world.
Mhm. That's good. That's good. So probably, I mean, it's very unfortunate that in our lives, we humans possibly are trying to behave as the boss of the earth,
Yeah,
which we are not,
totally
and
not.
our each and every driver is basically economy. I mean, whatever we do in our life is revolving around money, which is probably impacting the in a worst possible way to the nature actually.
And for a country like India and most of the country who is the global south,
Yeah.
who are like, we need to catch up in development. We
Mm-hmm.
kind of have started using economic growth and development interchangeably. And I feel that we need to start separating that as well. That of course, for a country like India, we need to increase our energy needs. I mean, I'm not saying that we need to decrease our carbon footprint, because actually we do not have much.
Yeah.
But having said that, we also need not follow exactly the same path that is being shown to us, right?
Exactly.
So
Good. Yep. I have many other questions, but I'll just stop here because I think there's someone else also should ask. Thank you
okay,
very much. Thank you.
thank you
Thank you
so
for the
much.
clarification. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gurpreet Singh. And this was a very interesting question that you had posed. Professor Vandana,
Yes.
I have a quick comment to make. So when we talk about farmers moving from agriculture to modern society, there are definitely a lot of societal and family pressures that permit them to do so. And you have also very well highlighted that, in the midst of everything, it is the job of the government to sort of think of creating some employment sources for them so that they stop doing it. On the other hand, my question is that there are many companies like PepsiCo, India Limited, uh, who happen to talk to farmers, get them onto contract, and they sort of take their lands on lease. Even if they aren't taking the lands on lease, they would actually ask them to grow a patented potato.
Yep.
Right?
The Lay's
And
potato.
yes, and it's quite surprising to see that the farmer is growing this particular potato almost for 10 odd years, and the family is carrying on with the legacy of doing it, probably because they are generally paid higher as compared to what they would have been doing otherwise. What is your comment on this, especially from the perspective of monoculture?
To be honest, farmers prefer or this way of thinking is not something that has captured our minds, but it has also captured the minds of people in the villages. Honestly, this discourse has spread. So yes, if the person needs income, and this whole mechanism is the mechanism of contract farming you're talking about, that PepsiCo has a contract with the farmer, and the price is fixed beforehand. It's written in the contract. So yes, it has become a major problem, but that has to, I think that can be addressed only if consumers are aware that this potato, what is this Lay's that I'm eating, where is it coming from? And that is, I don't think our consumer base is that conscious at all.
Absolutely, absolutely
So
rightly pointed. In fact, there's one concept that we are talking from a few years now in marketing, which talks about sustainable consumption.
yeah.
And it is actually all about what you've just pointed. educating the consumer, making them more aware of the kind of impact it has on biodiversity. And if you talk about fashion industry, this
Yes,
one particular industry is the highest
exactly,
contributor to such landfill.
exactly. Fast fashion
Fast fashion,
is is the is a huge culprit.
absolutely.
Uh, and somehow I feel there is a feminist perspective as well here. You know, you make us feel that we are empowered, and you capture our imagination when it comes to fashion and all of that. But what actually is that that's not free, that's not the kind of freedom that women would be wanting, because we're just making us
Absolutely
slaves
not.
to the market, right? So that's not real freedom. So
I strongly agree with what you said. Strongly agree. Uh, are there any other questions that the participants would like to ask us? Before I come to the close of the event, I would like to first announce that the center is going to organize the next lecture tomorrow at 6:30 in the evening. The lecture will be delivered by Ms. Sarika Chakrabarti. She is an urban planner associated with National Institute of Urban Affairs, with more than nearly 2 decades of cross-sectoral experience in urban infrastructure and transportation projects. I request you all to please mark your scheduler for this very interesting lecture that we are coming up with tomorrow evening. I would like to now take this opportunity to thank Professor Vandana Sharma for taking out her valuable time and delivering such a wonderful discussion. Believe you me, Professor Vandana, there were certain things that even I, as a professor, couldn't think of. And I am highly thankful to you for value adding to my wisdom as well. On behalf of JGBS and CAPBREI, I thank the members of CAPBREI team for organizing this webinar. I heartfully thank all the participants for being a wonderful audience and taking some very great insights from the table today. Thank you all very much, and please stay safe. Please take care of yourself.
thank you so much.